Did you ever hear the tragedy of J.K. Rowling the billionaire? Ironic, she could save others from being constrained by the will of overzealous authors, but not herself.
Hey guys, I'm going to talk about J.K. Rowling. Worth noting that my background is different. That's because I am in London. I need to be very careful here because I'm told if you criticize J.K. Rowling, they are legally allowed to kill you. In any case, this video is about J.K. Rowling's conflicting relationship with authorial intent and about its wider implications for the world of fiction in general. That's a tall order to fill, so let's get started. So with regards to interpreting fiction, we have two different belief systems here that we're going to contrast, authorial intent and death of the author. I'm going to talk a bit more about both of those views in this video, but you should know that the main distinguisher between them is their answer to the question, who does a work of fiction belong to, the fans or the author? Just as a note, I'm using the word author here because it's the most concise way to express what I mean, but this isn't exclusive to books. This also applies to TV, film, and any other artistic medium. Put in the simplest terms, authorial intent is the idea that the correct interpretation of a work of fiction is whatever interpretation is most in line with the author's intentions. So, for example, suppose we have a book about a world populated by monsters and humans where the main character is a monster hunter. Throughout the story, we get hints that the main character might be a monster herself, but in the actual story, it's never officially confirmed, leading fans to wonder whether she was a monster or not. Some fans might interpret the story as saying she was a monster all along, and some might interpret it as saying that she was always human. And then suppose, a little while later, the author does an interview where he says, actually, she was human. If you believe in authorial intent, that means you now believe that the only correct way to interpret the original story is that she was human, and any interpretations that suggest she was a monster are now automatically incorrect. On the other hand, we have death of the author. The idea here is essentially that even if an author intended to say something, if what's actually there on paper doesn't correspond to that, then neither the author's intentions nor anything they say outside of their original work of fiction should be given any special weight when it comes to how people should interpret their work. So with regards to the earlier example, someone who believes in death of the author might say, yeah, the author said afterwards that she was a human, but in the story itself, it's clearly very evident that she's a monster. So sure, he intended to show that she was human, but what was actually done was quite different. So one famous example of this is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There are constant arguments between fans and academics about whether or not his book was an allegory for war. And war was definitely part of Tolkien's experiences. He was a lieutenant during World War I, and many of his friends died in battle. He was also believed by many nowadays to have experienced shell shock, or what we now call PTSD. Frodo experiences some very comparable symptoms after his journey. He's tired of war, he can't quite find inner peace, he still has bad dreams of what happened. Overall, he's tired. Similarly, a lot of themes in Lord of the Rings are heavily reminiscent of the first two world wars. Both Europe and Middle-earth, for the first time, are facing internal conflicts involving increasingly industrialized enemies, traveling through these desolate landscapes created by these more powerful than ever products of war, and were bonded together by camaraderie in the face of possible death. This interpretation isn't de facto the correct one, but there are certainly arguments to be made in its favor. So, was Lord of the Rings an allegory? Well, according to Tolkien, no. In fact, he famously hated allegory and asserted that even if his work was applicable to certain circumstances, he didn't write it with the intention of directly mirroring them. And if you believe in authorial intent, the conversation ends there. Tolkien didn't intend for it to be an allegory, Tolkien says it's not an allegory, therefore it's not an allegory. But if you're a proponent of death of the author, this might not be a satisfactory answer for you. Sure, Tolkien didn't intend for it to be an allegory, but does that automatically mean it isn't one? If many elements in the actual work of fiction are pointing to it being an allegory, does the fact that the author didn't intend for it to be one actually matter? Again, that depends on where you're coming from with regards to how fiction should be interpreted. But to go back to that question we talked about at the beginning, the main gist of these two conflicting ideas is that for people who believe in authorial intent, it's the author who primarily owns the story and gets to be the sole arbiter of how their work should be interpreted. For people who follow death of the author, that right to interpretation belongs to everyone. Once you've finished your work and put it out there, you forfeit the right to be the only person to determine how it's interpreted. So why am I even talking about all of this? I'm bringing it up because of how all this relates to one of, if not the most culturally significant works of our time, the Harry Potter series. I know, I'm sorry. But to pretend the series hasn't had a massive impact on our culture in so many ways and doesn't continue to do so doesn't benefit anyone. And I'm not actually here to talk about the Harry Potter series itself. Instead, I want to talk about J.K. Rowling's later work with the series and why I think fully subscribing to authorial intent in this case can be harmful. So let's get started. Since I'm talking about J.K. Rowling in this video, it's worth mentioning that most of the people watching this video will have already made their minds up about her as a whole. She's a fantastic writer, hilarious tweeter, and a role model to authors everywhere. Or she's a mediocre writer with an overinflated ego who filled her books with harmful tropes and shitty writing. I'm not here to start a fight with either of those people, so just like this video isn't about Harry Potter as a whole, this isn't about J.K. Rowling as a whole either. Rather, I'm just going to be talking about what she's done as it relates to her connection with Harry Potter fans. So if I say something in this video that you take as either a defense or an attack on Rowling as a whole person, please keep in mind that I'm only talking about one small facet of a very large picture. Otherwise, this video would be 4 hours long. I'm pretty sure none of you want to watch that. I definitely don't want to make that. So one thing to note right away about J.K. Rowling's connection to authorial intent is that we're getting a deeply conflicting story. On one hand, we have J.K. Rowling as one of the first big-name authors to be relatively permissive of derivative works. This J.K. Rowling has been one of the most important figures in normalizing fan works on a large scale. On the other hand, we have the J.K. Rowling who's actively campaigned against alternative interpretations of her characters and has clung to perpetually controlling and editing the narrative long after it's been put out into the world. And on first glance, it's very difficult to work out what to make of this. Is this something that's good for the long-term cultivation of a fan community or something that's actively harmful to it? Is having a strong fan community for your works even an inherent good in the first place? It's sort of a metatextual devil's snare, and there's a lot to untangle. So let's start with the first interpretation of J.K. Rowling's relationship with her fans and look at some of the positives before this video goes full salt mode. And it will. It will go full salt mode, but you gotta be patient. When we're looking at communities that challenge authorial intent, fanfiction is necessarily going to come up. This isn't the only way authorial intent is challenged. You also have academic discussions of certain works, among other things, but it is one of the biggest and most accessible ways this happens, so I'm mostly going to talk about that. Nowadays, fanfiction and fan works on a larger scale are relatively mainstream. This has kind of always been the case for public domain works like Shakespeare or Sherlock Holmes. By the way, the best fanfictions based on both of those works are the Gnome adaptations. You cannot change my mind. But we're also seeing this popularity for works that aren't public domain. So especially with the advent of YouTube, we're seeing rises in things like fan films, which are often released for free and by fans. For instance, the wildly successful video game series Danganronpa, which is about a bunch of teenagers who are trapped in a school and forced to kill each other, has inspired dozens of fan-made spin-offs, some of which rival the quality of the original. Here's a trailer for an upcoming fan series called Danganronpa Kill Cure, which has gained almost 350,000 views. Or, going back to traditionally written fanfiction, it's now very common for multiple panels at conventions to be dedicated to fanfiction, often with published authors as panelists. And more nowadays than ever, a lot of published authors will openly admit to the fact that they got their start writing fanfiction, from Meg Cabot to Rachel Hawkins to Neil Gaiman. But as normalized as it is nowadays to write and publish stories, or fan movies, or animations based on your favorite characters, this is actually a pretty recent development. Okay. History time. This might seem a bit long, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this, and it's not just an excuse for me to ramble about one of my niche interests, so bear with me here. Up until somewhere between the late 90s and mid-2000s, fanfiction was regularly treated as this secretive, illicit practice that you didn't publicly talk about engaging in. And that wasn't because fanfiction was viewed as cringy or embarrassing, although that was a thing too. Rather, the popular opinion among a lot of prolific authors at the time was that fanfiction, and derivative works as a whole, were terrible perversions of the original works. They were disrespectful of the wishes of their author, they bastardized the characters, and anyone who engaged in those practices simply lacked the necessary creativity to make their own worlds. Unsurprisingly, the opinion was particularly strong as it related to any fanfictions with LGBT themes. Now, obviously, not every single author thought fanfiction was terrible and evil, but it was a very standard and popular opinion at the time, and you certainly didn't see a lot of prolific authors voicing their support for fanworks. So not only was there this very intense social pressure against creating fanworks, but also a very real legal pressure. Probably the best known example of this in action is Anne Rice's response to fanfiction of her Vampire Chronicles series. In 2000, she posted a message on her website stating, "I do not allow fanfiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fanfiction with my characters." Nowadays, as an author, if you tweeted, "I don't allow fanfiction of my works," you would probably get laughed out of the room. You just physically can't ban it as an author. It's not under your control. The internet is a thing. But at the time, this was taken really seriously, especially because the legal question of public not-for-profit fanfiction of works that weren't public domain was kind of new ground. Was it even legal to write and publish fanfiction online, provided you weren't making any money off of it? The general consensus seemed to be a resounding, I don't know. And indeed, Anne Rice was known to send her lawyers after any fanfictions of her works that she could find. A lot of fans reported receiving threatening letters, being doxxed, and having lawyers threaten to contact their employers. Now, obviously, if this is true, this is really shitty and goes beyond the legal parameters of a simple cease and desist no matter what, but again, the consequence for this is felt much more harshly for fans who included LGBT themes in their works. If any lawyers made good on the threat of contacting the writer's employers, it wouldn't just be about having one's hobby outed to their workplace, but also a major facet of their identity that was decently likely to get them fired. Needless to say, very few people wanted to get involved in a legal battle with a wealthy author about a legally nebulous situation, so most people deleted their fanworks pretty quickly. One of the most popular websites for posting fanworks at the time, fanfiction.net, decided to actively ban any fanfiction of Rice's works for the fear of legal retaliation. As one Vampire Chronicles fan in 2002 put it, "If there are any fanfictions on the net, they are so well hidden that unless you have the Addy, you won't find them." Just an aside, on probably the most popular fanfiction website nowadays, Archive of Our Own, there are currently 879 published fanfictions for the Vampire Chronicles, and the most recent one was updated today. Full disclosure, I have never read the series, but sometimes I just like to peruse the Vampire Chronicles tag on AO3 just to be smug about it. So anyway, Anne Rice is one of the best known authors for doing this, but it would be a mistake to assume that this kind of action was exclusive to her. Lawyers for The X-Files, Meredith Lackey's many book series, the Archie comic series, yeah, they've really successfully prevented their series from being bastardized, huh? The Ender's Game series, and many more popular books repeatedly threatened to sue writers for publishing fanfiction online. Author Robin Hobb even wrote a lengthy rant on her website in which she called fanfiction a personal masturbation fantasy, identity theft, unhealthy, an attack on the author, inherently uncreative, and akin to photoshopping someone's family photo into porn and posting it online. And then finally, she included this interesting bit here. "When I write, I want to tell my story directly to you. I want you to read it exactly as I wrote it." We're going to come back to that later, but for the time being, suffice it to say, fanfiction was not the widely accepted public affair that it is today, and many people who wrote it had to be very secretive about it. A lot of times, if a fanfiction author started to get their original works published, they'd have to go back and delete any trace of their fanfiction for fear that it would harm their writing career. It wasn't uncommon for fanfiction to be sequestered off to secretive email lists that you had to be specifically invited onto. It was a very different and much less public affair, and again, this small community aspect meant that if your stories primarily focused on people with marginalized identities in a way that the larger community didn't like, you really didn't have much of an opportunity to publicly engage with those stories. But as we've said repeatedly, things are very, very different now. We've already talked about fanfiction as a much more public and less secretive affair, and a lot of that has to do with two things. So first of all, fanfiction communities have greater resources at hand and are much more collectivized, which is where you see things like Archive of Our Own forming. It's essentially a crowd-funded foundation that not only hosts fanfiction, but also legally advocates for fanfiction writers who are being sued for their works. So 20 years ago, if you were an author who wanted to get a fanfiction taken down, you'd just have to contend with the writer who's probably like 19 and can barely afford ramen, let alone legal services. They're almost definitely going to get scared and take it down. But nowadays, if you want that fanfiction taken down, you'll have to go toe-to-toe with an established legal nonprofit that exists for the sole purpose of keeping that fanfiction online. So that's one reason. But the second thing, and the thing that really helped set the stage for this collectivization to come about in the first place, is a shift in public opinion. So what we see nowadays is that it's much less socially acceptable for authors to brazenly admit that they hate fanfiction and will try to sue people who write it. You do still have prolific authors who don't like fanfiction. George R.R. Martin has vocally said he disagrees with people writing it, but his stance seems to be, do whatever you want, just don't send it to me. Which, fair. There are legal reasons authors don't read fanfiction of their own works, and it's mostly about them not wanting to get sued. Even Anne Rice redacted some of her comments about fanfiction in 2013, saying that she could understand young writers using fanfiction as a transitional phase to practice their writing skills, even if she personally wouldn't choose to read or write it. So it's important to look at how this shift in public opinion actually came about, and a large portion of that is actually due in part to J.K. Rowling. Okay, finally bringing it back to the whole point of this video. Sorry that took so long. I hope you at least found it interesting. In this culture where fanfiction bad was so ubiquitous, J.K. Rowling was actually one of the first big-name writers to be like, yeah, I'm cool with it. In 2004, she issued a statement through a spokesperson saying that she was flattered people wanted to write stories about her characters, and that as long as no one was making any money off of it and X-rated fanfiction was kept away from kids, it was pretty cool that people were inspired by her stories. Writing fanfiction might even help them become published authors someday. An author giving their blessing for fanfiction now is pretty standard fare, but in 2004 it was a pretty big deal. Beyond just giving her blessing for transformative works, though, she's also actively engaged with the community in a really awesome and unprecedented way. In fact, every year from 2004 to 2007, she gave out what she called the J.K. Rowling Fansite Award, where she would choose several fan sites, display them on her website, and give the fan sites a special banner they could use if they chose. Many of these sites, like the Harry Potter Lexicon, MuggleNet, and Emeritus, hosted fanfiction, fan art, and other derivative works. Just as a side note, there were later legal issues against the Harry Potter Lexicon after they tried to publish a for-profit book, which is murky territory. But as a whole, her attitude towards fan works was a really welcome one that allowed for the flourishing of a very active and public fan community. Now, again, Rowling was not the first author to be pro-fanfiction, nor was she the only one at the time. My intention here is not to discredit the many other authors and writers like Gene Roddenberry and Tamora Pierce who held similar views. But Rowling was in a unique position here because of the sheer popularity of her works. That matters because, first of all, J.K. Rowling herself held a lot of social capital. The BBC was not going to publish an article talking about Robin Hobb's fanfiction rant, but when Rowling came out in support of fanfiction, it got reported by actual news outlets with massive convincible readerships. But it's also worth mentioning that that social capital kind of extended to the fans themselves. Because there was so much Harry Potter fanfiction compared to fanfiction of other more obscure works, these were large fan communities with a lot of influence over the world of fanfiction in general. If your massive community suddenly has free rein to share your stories publicly without the fear of being sued, that influence will eventually translate into, 1, the fan collectivization we talked about earlier, and 2, other fan communities beginning to copy and emulate you. Over the course of 5-7 years, it's easy to see how that influence grew into the large normalization of fanfiction we see today, both from other authors and from the general public. So, is this a good thing and why? I think the encouragement of transformative works is categorically good. For one, it encourages people to think critically about what they're reading. Obviously, it's not the only way people can do that, but it can be a really effective one. By analyzing a work, pulling out themes that you think were underexplored in the original, or things you want to improve or elaborate upon, you're engaging in a sort of meaning-making by which you're delving deeper into a work and thinking about it in an analytical way. This is especially good if an original work didn't do certain things very well. For example, you love Buffy, but you don't love how abusive relationships were handled on the show. This gives you the chance to practice critical thinking while creating meaningful work and developing your writing skills at the same time. And no, not every fanfiction is an incredibly profound character study. Some are just, here's a 20,000 word BDSM fest between Dobby and Creature. But I think that even these can be good too. It encourages engagement with the original work, tells the writer that you love the universe they created enough to want to make more of it, and lets people explore sexuality in a safe, familiar setting. So, I think generally speaking, J.K. Rowling's contributions to fanfiction culture have been good. And if you're someone who's very critical of Rowling, you're probably watching this video like, Wow, okay. So we're just gonna let her off the hook for everything else just because she was nice to fanfiction authors in the 2000s? And no. I have many more things to say. But understanding why so many fans, especially fans who were creators 15, 20 years ago, feel that her contribution to transformative art are very important is key to understanding why her later involvement with the series is so bizarre and frustrating. I'm also not saying that she endorsed fanfiction out of the goodness of her heart, so please don't take this section as me venerating Rowling. It's more likely that, on top of her just personally thinking fanfiction was cool, the decision to allow and in some cases promote it was a calculated choice. Active fan base publicly promoting your stories equals positive press equals dough. The only real downside to this is when a couple of stoned theater kids make a musical parody of your books and you have to forever live with the knowledge that it's better than your entire series.
There's no way we're losing to Slytherin or Ravenclaw or Jigglypuff.
But with that said, we have this one view of Rowling as this really positive influence over the normalization of fan works. And if you asked the classic authorial intent question to that Rowling, she would probably answer that the fans are free to interpret her works in ways beyond what she originally intended. But that was then. This is now. And the Sorting Hat was trans. You know when you're taking an exam or writing an essay and you look it over and you're like, yeah, this is actually really good, and you print it out and hand it in, and then immediately after you're done handing it in, you find a massive typo, or you realize that one of your answers was dead wrong, or you remember a really good point you were going to bring in but completely forgot to? That's the worst feeling, right? But in that situation, you generally can't just submit a second paper that says, by the way, ignore everything I said in the first paper, this is what I mean. But if you wrote a book and realized there was something you wanted to write about but forgot to, or you just got a really good idea that you wished you'd put in there in the first place, and also you're a famous author with millions of adoring Twitter followers, you can do this all you want. Oh, by the way, werewolves was actually a metaphor for people with HIV. Oh, and Harry Potter supports Israel, and the Whomping Willow was a bottom. Definitely a bottom. And yeah. Over the past 11 years since the series ended, J.K. Rowling has been increasingly falling out of favor with fans for what a lot of people see as her incessantly tweaking the story. And while this didn't really happen while the series was still being written in the early 2000s, it didn't take long afterwards for it to get tiring. The last Harry Potter book was released in mid-2007, and that's when this intense self-editing started to happen. Later that year, interestingly enough, also the same year the J.K. Rowling Fansite Award ended, she confirmed in a press conference that Dumbledore was gay. In doing so, she sparked a lot of reactions, ranging from how dare you ruin this innocent children's series with your evil agenda to this is amazing representation for gay people everywhere and it'll help people realize we're just like you. But there was also, and continues to be, a lot of criticism from LGBT fans who thought, if you actually wanted to depict Dumbledore as gay, you should have done it in the original books. There's no risk associated with writing it after the fact, so it feels more like an attempt to look progressive for having a gay character without having to do the work of actually writing one. And so there are a few general defenses that get thrown up in response to this. The book is told through Harry's perspective, and it would have been out of character for Dumbledore to tell Harry what gender he was attracted to, it wasn't relevant to the plot, and it was sort of hinted at that he had a romantic relationship with Grindelwald anyway, which should be more than enough. So if we're looking at the issue of what the author actually intended to portray, there's a very easy way to answer this. What if we had an official Harry Potter story that was told not through the perspective of an oblivious teenager that actually explicitly featured Dumbledore and Grindelwald interacting, and that was geared towards an older audience who are more interested in the inner lives of adult characters? Would Rowling then have explicitly portrayed Dumbledore as gay? And unfortunately, we now know that the answer to that question is no. The upcoming Fantastic Beasts movie features Dumbledore in it and is literally called The Crimes of Grindelwald. The two are probably going to interact. So David Yates, the director of the film, stated in an interview that no, Dumbledore would not be explicitly portrayed as gay, and justified this by saying that at this point, fans were already aware of his sexuality anyway. Keep in mind, this isn't just some adjacent film over which Rowling has no control. She wrote the screenplay. So, it seems like Rowling not making Dumbledore gay in the books wasn't because it wasn't relevant to the plot or because it was from the perspective of a clueless teen. Because when it is relevant to the plot and it's not from the perspective of a clueless teen, it's still not there in canon. So when people see her getting all this praise for including a gay character without ever actually including a gay character, that's going to raise some larger concerns. But I don't want to get too hung up on this example, mainly because I already talked about it in my queerbaiting video, and because there are so many more cases of Rowling revealing random details about the Harry Potter series years later, and she's still doing it. Some of these can seem fairly harmless, if a bit annoying. For instance, telling everyone what certain characters' Patronuses were years after the series ended. But some of these things have garnered quite a bit of criticism, particularly in instances where it seemed as if the intent was to appear progressive and the result was the exact opposite. So for one, you have Rowling announcing that being a werewolf was actually a metaphor for HIV the whole time, and that it represented hysteria surrounding bloodborne illnesses. And there's really no way to work around the fact that this was done to look progressive. But that's a really bad metaphor. When you actively avoid or fear another person because they have HIV, there's no medical or scientific basis for that. That's just based on long-standing stereotypes about gay people. But being afraid of werewolves has a rational justification because they literally lose control of themselves and can either infect or kill you. And sure, they're normal people most of the time, but just look at how Rowling portrays them. You have one sympathetic portrayal of a werewolf in Lupin, who was infected as a child by an adult, so AIDS metaphor already going south, but every single other werewolf you encounter in this series is literally evil. You have Fenrir Greyback, who violently attacks multiple characters with the intention of infecting as many people as possible, and every other mention of werewolves in the series is accompanied by discussions of violent maulings. If your goal is to get readers to treat people with HIV kindly and respectfully, comparing them to a group of people who are mostly made up of violent attackers who try to infect children is a really, really bad way to go about that. Or you have the most recent controversy in the long list of J.K. Rowling announces something in an attempt to seem progressive, but it's actually terrible, with the reveal that Nagini, Voldemort's Horcrux/pet snake, was actually a Korean woman the whole time. So the story is that she was a maledictus, who are women born with a curse that eventually transforms them into animals. I mean, first of all, there's the obvious. It's so unnecessary. We were all cool with Nagini just being a big scary magic snake. No one wanted this. It adds nothing of value to the original story. But there are deeper issues with this as well. So the whole blood purity stuff was, at least in part, a metaphor for racism, and I think that's something that everyone can agree on. Like, Voldemort was obviously Wizard Hitler. So, just to recap, J.K. Rowling attempted to seem progressive by literally dehumanizing a Korean woman with cursed blood and turning her into the completely submissive pet of a wizard Nazi who drinks her milk and has her kill people at his command. Like, people aren't gonna see that as empowering representation, especially because that stereotype of East Asian women being hyper-submissive slave girls to racist dudes is not a new one, and it's something a lot of these women have to deal with in real life. She later claimed on Twitter that she was planning this from the very start. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's ill-advised either way. If she just made it up and then pretended it was her plan all along, bad. And if she was sitting on this for 20 years and throughout that long stretch of time didn't once have a moment of self-awareness, also bad. She's received a lot of similar criticism for other such announcements over the years. Another big example of this was how she handled skinwalkers in her North American stuff, for which she was accused of fundamentally misunderstanding important mythos in Navajo culture. So there's definitely a pattern here. The one criticism in this regard that I do want to address is this idea that in the wake of the Cursed Child casting, she announced on Twitter that Hermione was actually intended to be black all along. Left-leaning people tend not to like this because, you don't deserve praise for including representation if you didn't actually include representation, and right-leaning people tend not to like this because something cultural Marxist social justice warrior agenda. So the actual tweet was just her saying that she never specified Hermione's race in the book, which is true, and that she was supportive of the casting. Luckily, there is so much more other legitimate stuff to discuss. But I want to make it clear that the main problem here isn't that the things she's revealing are problematic. I mean, they are, and that's a huge problem, but Rowling including harmful tropes in her work without considering their implications isn't exclusive to her weird reveals. It's been a consistent theme throughout the series. Hey, remember the detestable hook-nosed goblins that controlled the banks? Or the race of slave creatures that just naturally wanted to be slaves and got confused and upset at any attempts to stop them from being slaves? I mean, there is so much to talk about with regards to the whole series itself, but I think fully exploring that warrants its own video, not just an aside in this video, and I honestly don't think I'm the best person to make that video. My point here is that the inclusion of harmful tropes in the Harry Potter universe has always existed in the series, and it needs to be addressed beyond just talking about Rowling's newer BS. But just with regards to the authorial intent stuff, even if none of her reveals were problematic, they would still be a problem. So besides all the obviously actively harmful stuff, you also get all these periodic reveals saying things like Hagrid doesn't have a Patronus, the Longbottoms stayed in the hospital for the rest of their lives, Dudley and Harry still see each other on occasion, etc. And the problem here isn't that she has thoughts about her own series. It would be silly to criticize someone for talking about a thing they wrote. Death of the Author doesn't say that an author's opinions outside their actual work don't matter, just that they don't matter any more than anyone else's opinions. Rather, the issue here is that she's actively cultivated an atmosphere that treats her intentions outside the original work as gospel. So, for example, you have this exchange here where a reader asks if Sirius was gay and Rowling responds no. Just to be clear, I don't think that it was homophobic or problematic of her not to make Sirius gay. This exchange could have been about anything, and I would still have the same problem with it. The issue here is that this culture actively discourages people from reading the books, thinking critically about them, and then generating their own thoughts and interpretations. You're not encouraged to look at the book, see what was said or implied about Sirius's sexuality, and draw your own conclusions from critical reading. Instead, the interpretation that Rowling is encouraging people to take of her works isn't what's actually gleanable from the source material, but just whatever the author feels like. You even have her playing a more active role in this debate by directly arguing with fans about their interpretations of the story. This is especially salient with anything to do with Snape. Obviously, we know how Rowling wanted to portray him as like a complex, tragic hero because she constantly talks about it. But based on what's actually there in the books, particularly Snape bullying Neville by threatening to kill his pet to the extent where the innocent kid who saw his parents get tortured to insanity viewed his teacher as his biggest fear, a lot of people instead interpreted what's there as Snape did a few good things, but as a whole, he's a weird incel dick, and the good things he did don't make up for, like, child abuse. And Rowling hates this interpretation to the extent where she constantly gets into Twitter fights with fans where she insists he had a good heart all along and that the fans are wrong. And that brings us back to Robin Hobb's fanfiction rant. When I write, I want to tell my story directly to you. I want you to read it exactly as I wrote it. I think that's something the earlier Rowling would probably categorically disagree with. Her promotion of transformative works to me says, my stories are up for interpretation. But what we see today is a Rowling who clings to the idea that the original text isn't the only arbiter of what is or is not canon, it's also her word after the fact. That Rowling would probably agree with Robin Hobb. And I think that's really harmful to the purpose of fan communities as a whole, which she ostensibly supports, when instead of thinking critically about the books and generating your own interpretations, you're instead encouraged to just ask the author what's true or not. That renders so much of fan communities' work meaningless. And as a result of that, a lot of people have just stopped listening to her or taking her seriously. There are hosts of articles and tweets online joking about her tendency to announce stupid shit out of nowhere. Snopes even had to issue a statement saying she didn't really announce Daniel Radcliffe was Chinese. She had built up so much goodwill from her fans that she's blown through relatively quickly as a result of her Twitter presence. She's like the Elon Musk of kids' books. Overall, I think this interpretation of J.K. Rowling as someone who's doing a lot of harm to these communities is really salient. So, on one hand, we have J.K. Rowling good. On the other hand, we have J.K. Rowling bad. So what do we make of this? I think these two interpretations aren't really coexisting. Rather, there's been a sort of shift in Rowling's relationship with the series, which I think is the result of two things. First of all, the books are finished, so previously, if she wanted to add something to the series, she'd just put it in her next book. But now, she can't do that. Hence, weird announcements. Secondly, I think the rise of social media is such that you can just say literally anything and millions of people will listen. In 2007, she had to hold a press conference to tell people that Dumbledore was gay. Now, she can just tweet it. And so I think the way to resolve this contradiction is as follows. J.K. Rowling was good, J.K. Rowling is bad. And again, one last time, this is shorthand. I'm not intending to literally say that Rowling is a horrible, terrible person as a whole, or that she used to be a wonderful, perfect angel as a whole. When I say good or bad, I'm just referring to their impact on fan culture and on how we interpret literature. Please don't accuse me of being either an apologist who wants to excuse her doing stuff like liking TERF tweets, or of being an evil call-out culture monster who wants to make sure everyone hates her. Please. With that out of the way, let's wrap this bad boy up. J.K. Rowling's relationship to her fan community is a deeply complex and varying one. On one hand, she was one of the most important figures in normalizing fanfiction and transformative works, which I've argued is a really good thing for both the author and the fans. On the other hand, her recent work with the series seems to actively discourage people from generating their own interpretations from what's available, instead arguing that what's right or wrong about the work should be instead determined by the author's feelings. This is really harmful because 1, it stifles creativity, 2, it discourages critical thinking, and 3, many of these addendums to the source material are bad. This was definitely the result of a massive shift at the end of the series, and it's okay to simultaneously criticize her later work while still recognizing her positive contributions to fan communities in the past, and vice versa. Overall, though, I think I speak for many Harry Potter fans when I say, J.K. Rowling, please stop. Oh, and by the way, this YouTube video was actually a metaphor for the Cuban Missile Crisis the whole time. Have fun making sense of that one. I'm off to see The Cursed Child and cry a lot. On top of a thank you to all my patrons, I would also like to specially thank my new $20 plus tier patrons. So thank you so much to Jordy Hamilton, Luke Elrickman, Edward Ridge, and Valium Sad Femme McDouble, which is probably the most beautiful name I have ever heard.